Assalamu alaikum. My name is Firas Hamdan. I was born and raised in Massachusetts. My mother is a Southern Baptist Protestant Christian. Also born and raised in Massachusetts. My father is Lebanese, from the South. He's Shia Muslim. I grew up mostly around my mother. I grew up Christian, going to church on Sundays, celebrating Christmas, Easter, all of these things. The area that I grew up in is mostly, Anglo-Saxon, white American, Christian. Was not a very diverse area. I think the nearest mosque was about an hour and a half away. Halal meat is also an hour and a half away. Anything pretty much like Islamic or ethnic or anything is very far. So you can imagine like the area and, what I had to grow up around. But for the most part, everything I've known my whole life until I was about 13, 14 years old was typical American. I ate pork, I did all those things. I didn't know it was wrong. My father, he's, Muslim, but wasn't, as practicing as he could have been. So for the most part, my knowledge about Islam was pretty much, all I knew was you don't drink and, they believe that there's one God and Muhammad is their prophet. Other than that, I had not much more knowledge about Islam. So you could say for the most part I was raised as a typical white American, not knowing much about being Arab or being Muslim. All my life I did have this sense of belonging to a higher power. I always believed that there was a God. Even while I was going to church and while I was, I guess you could say Christian, I always had this uncertainty of, when I was practicing Christianity because of the, Holy Trinity, Jesus, the Son of God, all of these things. I was just told to believe it. My mom would always tell me about it, and everybody I grew up around, it was a very common thing. But all I know is that from a young age, I always knew that there had to have been a God, and that he'd have to have at least a universal message for everybody to live by. And I wasn't, obviously, as a young kid, I wasn't exactly sure of what that was. I had a lot of questions, that arose during, when I was young, going to church and stuff like that. But I didn't have anybody that would satisfy those answers. My mother, she was a very devout Christian, and she still is. But she's by no means a scholar, obviously. So, I definitely always had this, belief in a God, my whole life. I first heard about Islam when I was, around, I'd say 11 or 12 years old. This was during the time when, 9/11 happened. The reason I heard about it obviously is because during school time, everyone's talking about it, all this, Muslims are terrorists and stuff like that. And, when I was growing up, kids, they didn't know that I was, Arab. They just thought, I had a weird name. They just thought okay, he's got dark hair, dark eyes. He could be Italian or Mexican or something. They didn't know what I was, so, but they did know that my dad was foreign or something, and I guess somewhere along the lines they found out that my father is Muslim. And they used to say a lot of things oh, your father is the reason for this, his people, etc., etc. And I mean, I was 11, 12 years old at this time, and I didn't know how to defend my own father, because I didn't know much about Islam. I knew not even the bare essentials of Islam. Very few things. So, I was actually afraid, because I was is this what my dad, what my relatives are like, da da da. I was it can't be true. So I used to, I'd go to my dad, I ask him some questions. My dad, he just gave me very broad, basic questions. I kept asking him very specific things. And again, he wasn't able to really answer a lot of the questions I had. So I had really no other choice than to go to the library, to go online. I searched anything I could, all these lecturers on YouTube. And that's basically when I started researching into Islam, and once I watched one video, it got me hungrier for another one and another one and another one. And, it came to a point where my father, he actually caught me at nighttime, at like 2, 3 in the morning on a school night. And I was downstairs, and back then we only had one computer in our house, and I was on that at like 3, 4 in the morning, just watching lectures of, Ahmed Didat debating Christians, about how Jesus doesn't say in the Bible that I'm the Son of God and any of this stuff. So I would say from like 12 years old, that's when I started researching. And it took me about, I'd say 2, 3 years of, watching lectures and reading so many books to finally convert to Islam. And at that point, it took a lot out of me. It was very hard for me to let go of that belief that Jesus is the Son of God, because ever since I was a kid, that's all I've ever been taught. If you don't accept him, you're going to go to hell because of this. And, it wasn't like a very quick thing. It wasn't like, I heard one verse and I was like, that's it. Or I heard one thing and that was it. It took a lot of convincing, because obviously I had my own bias. I heard many things about what Islam says, this and that, and I had to satisfy it. So it was around 12 years old, I'd say. That's when I started. The need to search and to figure out what exactly Islam was, I think it was more of a way of trying to justify, my father is a good person, because, a lot of people at that time were saying, this and that about Islam, terrorists, they abuse women, they're chauvinistic, all kinds of stuff like this. So, and I know my father is not like that, obviously. So I just wanted to kind of feel good about myself and know that that's not the case. But what I found was much more. I found truth in it, I found things that made much more sense than what I was already believing, going to church and stuff like that. They brought up a lot of questions that I couldn't argue, and it basically just opened my mind. I always wondered why, we're supposed to be a monotheistic religion, Christianity, yet we have 3 gods. You can pray to God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit. I never really understood how is that, one God. That's one of the things that really attracted to me, Islam. Islam, it's very simple. One God, one prophet, and that's really what attracted me the most to it. At that time, because, I had no, friends, no relatives, no Muslim contacts at all. When I went online, most of what I seen, most of the websites I found, lecturers I found, were Sunni websites or Sunni speakers. So at that time, that's what I believed in, and for the most part, I was more concerned with the oneness of God. I wasn't really going into, the history so much about Islam. I was mostly concerned with, what do they say about God? What is God like? Does God look like a person? Does he have blonde hair and blue eyes? Can you see what God looks like? All of these things. Those, I think, were the points that I really looked for. The books I looked for were about that. The lectures I looked for were about this kind of thing. So I would say for about, from 12, 13 years old until 18, that whole time, I was a practicing Sunni Muslim. I looked up online how to pray like a Sunni, all of these things. I practiced exactly like a Sunni. So during the period between I was 12 to 18 years old, this whole time, I was very serious. At that time, I went to school, I played sports and stuff like that. I was the only Arab/Muslim in my entire school. From elementary school to middle school all the way to high school. Never had Muslim or Arabs as classmates. I was the only one. And, in a way, I kind of liked it. I was very very serious, and I wanted to be a good example for everybody else, you know. And I was not afraid of being different. I remember my junior year in high school, I decided I wear like the skull cap. I think they call it a kufi. I wore it to school every single day. You know, I wanted people, you know, I wanted people to come up and ask me, why do you wear this? Why are you, you know, like this? You know, why don't you eat pork and stuff like that? Of course, during that time, I was still eating, you know, haram meat, you know, and all that other stuff. But they don't know, they didn't know that what I was doing was wrong. But yeah, I always, like, I kind of wanted to attract this attention. And I think that's, in the beginning, that's what I really liked about Sunni Islam, because they do, you know, they have a lot of da'wah, like, videos and stuff like that. They go out to non-Muslims very much, and they're very active. And that's kind of how I was. You know, I was very, like, out there. I was, like, you know, debating people a lot in school, Christians, Jews, you know, I was very into that, you know, especially with Christians. I always, anytime, you know, there was people talking about politics or religion, I wanted to be the first one in there and say my 2 words, you know. But when I was 18 years old, a senior in high school, you know, my father, you know, it's not like my father didn't see all this. He noticed, he's like, oh, my son, he's a Salafi, like, he's praying like this, you know, he's saying everything is like bid'ah, you know, and you know, my dad had a conversation with me. He's like, you know, why are you Sunni or whatever? You know, he started saying a lot of things. He's like, you know, they did this and they did that or whatever. And I wouldn't take anything my dad would say seriously because, you know, at the beginning, when I started researching Islam, I kind of established that my dad is not like a valid resource of what, you know, religion is. So, I would argue with him about these things, and I would, you know, beat him with the Sunni argument against my dad who's Shia, you know. So, you know, I said to myself, I was like, okay, you know, I was turned off already by, you know, Shiism. I seen a lot of things online, you know, pictures, stuff like that. You know, I would be in a lot of chat rooms and stuff online saying that Shia, they hate the, you know, companions, they hate all of these things, you know, hate, all these. So I was just wondering, like, what made them hate these people so much, or do they hate these people so much? All of these questions kind of arose. So I was like, you know, I owe it to my dad, why don't I just, like, check into this, see what it's like? So I started trying to find Sunni Shia, you know, debates online. And mostly what I just kept finding was Sunnis talking about Shiism. I never really found a lot of lecturers of Shiism, Shia lecturers talking about Shia Islam. So I kept getting a lot of these people saying, you know, that they, you know, during like Ashura, they turn off the lights and they commit adultery with each other. They, you know, believe that, you know, Ali is above the Prophet. They worship the Imams, like all of these things. So I was like, you know what, when I was going to church, people would say a lot of things about Islam. So I was like, okay, this sounds a lot like what I was told about Muslims before I became Muslim. So let me look into it a little bit more. So I started listening to some lectures. I found a few. I found Hajj Hassanin Rajabali. I found Sayyid Ammar Nakshawani. I found a few others too. And, you know, they started talking about the history a little bit more, and I realized I didn't know too much about the history. I just know more about like the theology, just basically beliefs in God and stuff like that. So when I started looking into the history, Imam Hussein came up. That was the biggest thing for me when I decided to lean more towards the Shia school of thought. I never heard about the martyrdom of Imam Hussein before that. You know, some of the hadiths and stuff like that I heard when I was listening to Sunni lectures, most of it was when Hassan and Hussein were little kids. Very little things about them. Almost nothing. You know, I knew Imam Hussein was killed, but I didn't know it was a massacre or anything like that. I was not taught that. So the first thing that I seen about Imam Hussein when I heard about the massacre, that made me really doubt everything that I ever learned. You know, when all these books that I read, all the lectures I heard. You know, I used to listen to Khalid Yassin. I used to listen to Hamza Yusuf, Ahmed Didat, Yusuf Estes, all these guys, all these Sunni lecturers. Never once did I hear anything about Imam Hussein and Karbala and how he was sacrificed. So once I heard about that made me dive into the world of Shiism. So when I first decided that, Shiaism is for me, and that I accepted the path of Ahlul Bayt, was a little bit after learning about the tragedy of Karbala, and then after that I started looking more into Imam Ali and his life and what actually happened. Some of the answers that started to make sense. I seen some battles like the Battle of Jamal. I'd see Ali radiallahu anhu fights against Aisha radiallahu anha. And at first I didn't think anything of it. But then I was thinking, how can, thousands of Muslims die in this battle and there's not one right or wrong side? If I was there, one question that I was asked before by a Muslim when I was online researching a lot, he asked me, he said, if you're a Christian, right, you believe that Jesus, has to be sacrificed for you to be saved. He said, if you were there during the time of Jesus being sacrificed, would you try and save him? Or what side would you be on? Because if you save him, then he's not dying for your sins. So, who do you accept as God? And it's kind of like a situation that basically shows all the imperfections in it. In Sunni Islam, if you were there during the time in the Battle of Jamal, with Ali on one side and Aisha on the other, you have to choose. There's a right or a wrong side. And that made me think about many other things. There's a lot of other battles, obviously Battle of Safin, the Prophet said, Ammar ibn Yasir, he'll die shaheed on the right side. Who killed Ammar ibn Yasir? Ammar ibn Yasir was killed by Muawiyah. So a lot of these things, it just kept adding up, and I didn't know any of these things. I know I know about, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, a lot of their good deeds, while I was Sunni. But I never heard any of these other very controversial things. And once I started seeing that, it was like an onion. It just kept peeling and peeling and peeling, and it kept smelling worse. And Shi'ism, everything that I was told about it, they had an answer for. There was a lot of things that I was very uncomfortable about, about Mut'a, about, the 12 Imams, and do you pray to them, or what is it, Tawassul, or, etc., all these questions. I got an answer for it, and I got not just a Quran verse, but I also got hadith to back it up, tafsir, and all of these things. And a lot of the Shias that I listened to online, they were just extremely knowledgeable in history. It was like sitting in a history class. Most of the lecturers that I heard that were Sunni, they talked more about just kind of like, rational thoughts, like, okay, of course God is one. Like, they would talk about Christians, like, how can you believe, that Jesus is the Son of God? Don't you have, a mind? God is one. So when I was becoming Shia, and I was thinking, like, all of these guys, they would talk so confidently to these Christians and saying, how can you believe in the Trinity and all these things? You're an adult. Well, I was thinking, if you guys are talking about how can they believe that, you have Imam Ali. He was born in the Kaaba. He was, the successor of the Prophet. All of these things that he has, under his belt. And you put him as the same as other people. All of these things that I was seeing in Christianity that I, thought that made me doubt, I was finding them a lot within Sunni Islam. And Shia Islam, I did not find any faults. Every question that I had, I was given a very satisfying answer. So when I first, reverted or converted again to Shi'ism, that was, I would say, my real conversion. Because before, when I was Sunni, I used to eat, anything chicken, there was, haram food and stuff like that. When I became Shia, I was like, okay, that's it. Like, I've, looked at it from every angle possible. This is, the true religion of God. So I took it very seriously. I remember one day I was at home, and for a while now I've been eating haram meat while I was Shia, and I was like, okay, I can't. In my head I kept saying, I can't do this. I can't go on for much longer eating this and knowing that it's wrong. So one day my mom, she made a meal for us. We sat down, and I looked at it and I'm like, all right, that's it. This is my last meal. This is it. Like, I can't keep doing this anymore. So I told my mom, I said, listen, I'm going to eat this right now, but I'm telling you from now on, I'm not eating any more meat unless it's halal meat, okay? And my mom thought I was joking, and my mom actually didn't even understand, the concept of like halal and not, halal meat. So, of course, what's she gonna do? She's my mother. She's been cooking food for me since I was a kid, and I've been eating it. My mom's an amazing cook, obviously. So she was very angry. I knew it was gonna happen because I know my mom's thoughts about Islam. She's, it's been very hard practicing, around my mom because I know it bothers her a lot, and she's, she prays a lot for me. She always thinks that I'm gonna come back and stuff like that, and always invites me to her Bible studies. But sometimes I go just for whatever. But anyways, I remember she told me, she said, if you're gonna do that, if you're gonna start eating, blessed meat, then I'm not gonna cook anything for you anymore. So at that time, between 18 and 20 years old, when I graduated from high school until 20, my mom, she didn't cook any more meals for me. I had to cook everything for myself at home. That was probably the hardest time of my life. My parents at that time, they got divorced. My father, he moved back to Lebanon. I was home with my mother and my younger sister. I inherited a lot more responsibilities. And on top of that, I made my mom much more angrier than she needed to be. So at that time, it was very tough for me. And some of the friends that I made at the Sunni mosque that I used to go to, I didn't tell them right away. I kind of just didn't really say anything. I would bring up certain Shia beliefs, subtly. I kind of was using taqiyya in a way. I would bring up issues like, do you think the Prophet would never make a mistake? Or, come on, Imam Ali, I really think that he deserves a higher status than what he has, stuff like that. But eventually, they figured it out. I started praying differently. They started asking questions. Some of my friends, they were Maliki, so they prayed with their hands down, so they didn't really get right away that I was Shia. They just seen that I was starting to pray a little differently. But then, I started saying some stuff during, around Muharram, when I would go to the mosque and they would fast, on the 10th of Muharram. And I would find out exactly why they do that. It's, my friend, he told me, he's like, the 10th of Muharram is a good day, we should fast. And I was like, what do you mean? Why do we need to fast? His name was Fuad. I told him, I said, Fuad, this is the day that the grandson of the Prophet was martyred. This is a day we need to mourn. We should think about exactly, how, his family dealt with it and all these things and stuff like that. And he said, that was the first time I remember they're like, are you Shia? And I was like, I know I couldn't hide it anymore. I was like, yeah, I'm Shia. I can't do these things anymore. I know what's right and what's wrong. I can't pretend like I don't see them. And after that, I noticed they started distancing themselves, so they stopped, asking me to hang out as much. I remember one time after a few months, they asked me to come to their house. It was like a big group of friends. They invited me down into their basement where we used to hang out. And, they were very serious, very, very serious. They're usually always joking around, stuff like that, but they were all very serious. And at this time, they were all they grew their beards very long, and they were wearing dish dashes all the time. I noticed a big difference within a few months, period. They sat down, they told me, they're like, for us, listen, you're our friend, and, you can't be Shia. We care about you, we don't want you to go to hell. You can't be Shia. They're like, what's the deal? Why are you Shia? Just because your father is Shia, you don't have to be Shia. First thing I told him was, I'm not Shia because my father's Shia. I was Sunni before, so obviously I'm not Shia now just because my father told me to. If he told me to be Shia, I would have been Shia a long time ago if I wanted to believe it from him. So they started asking questions. I would give them, a lot of things that, I was saying, ways of doing wudu and stuff like that. hadiths of, Abu Hanifa and Imam Jafar al-Sadiq alayhi salam. But everything that they said, they're like, no, this is not true, and this is not true. Anytime I'd ask them, okay, can you give me, an argument for this from the Quran, from a hadith, anything like that, they just say, no, like, you guys, you have made up, like, hadiths, they're not, strong. Even they would say you have a different Quran. I told them, well, okay, if we have a different Quran, okay, you have a Quran over there, let's take your Quran and let's see, how it goes. So, obviously that didn't get anywhere. I didn't hang out with, my Sunni friends as much. So I started trying to look for Shias within my area. By within my area, I mean like, they lived at least an hour and a half away. Because where I live, there's nothing. There's no Shia, there's no Muslims, let alone anything, ethnic at all. So I started looking like on Facebook, anything for like Shia groups within Massachusetts, I found a couple that lived in a nearby city, and I sent them a message. I said, hey, is there any like Shia mosque around here? Is there any Shia like scholars, sheikhs, something like that? And, alhamdulillah, he got me connected with some brothers, and, I was able to go to an actual majlis for Imam Hussein. I remember the first majlis I ever went to during Ashura, it was the night of Abbas. And I didn't know at all what was being said. It was all in Arabic. Matter of fact, it wasn't even a lecturer. It was, we went to a small house. There must have been like 30 people at max. And we were just watching a TV of a guy speaking, and I didn't understand anything he was saying. I'd ask, one of the guys I was with, who was he talking about? He said he was talking about, Abu Fadl Abbas. And he was, explaining to me more detail in the story. And I remember that day was like very strong for me. I was like, I remember from that day I was like, that's it, I'm gonna find an area where there's Shia, and I have to be there, because not only I'm very isolated from Muslims in general, but like being around Shia, there's nobody I know. So when I was 20 years old, I transferred to a college that was in Boston, closer to the inner city, and there was a Shia center there that was a little bit bigger. I went there, and that's when I learned a lot more. I would read much more books, Peshawar Nights, Najl al-Balagha, of course, a lot of books by Imam Zain al-Abidin. But that was I'd say the biggest point when I was Shia was the first night that I went to a majlis for for Abu Fadl Abbas. The Ahlul Bayt, they saved me from a very like troubling existence in life. When I was younger, when you come from like a mixed family, when your mother's American, Anglo-Saxon white, your father is Arab, he's Muslim, and my mother's Christian, you have an identity crisis. I didn't know where I belonged. I was struggling being a Christian. I didn't know like if Muslim is the right faith and stuff like that. But once I got satisfied with the path of Ahlul Bayt, they saved me from a lot of things. Most of my family, they're not Muslim, and I see their lifestyles are much different than mine. Everybody I grew up around are not Muslim. They got into a lot of drugs, alcohol, partying, stuff like that, and I know I could have easily been influenced with that if I didn't have these role models like Imam Ali alayhi salam, like Imam Hussein alayhi salam, like all of the Imams we have, the Prophet, of course. If I didn't have, a solid foundation for Islam, as far as like when I first started learning, I could have easily fallen into this lifestyle. I was mostly in the world of sports. And in the world of sports, you get offered a lot of things. And if I didn't have a strong faith, in the Ahlul Bayt, then I would have easily fallen. So I definitely would have to thank Imam Hussein alayhi salam, because Karbala, when I learned of this, it was one of the strongest impacts in my life. That story with me was very strong. Anytime, I was going through difficulties, whether it was at school, or at home, or, anywhere else, I would think about, Imam Hussein and the sacrifice, about Abu Fadl, about, Ali Asghar, all of the Ahlul Bayt who were sacrificed during Karbala.